We potentially, we might actually complete the chapter this evening. Now, I know that some people get very nervous when I say that, because usually when we say that we're going to complete the chapter, then it doesn't necessarily end up happening. But I'm going to put it out there anyway, because it is in fact possible. Brief summary of the story up until this point. So we began the beginning of Tanya by telling us that every one of us has a responsibility. It's an undertaking that our neshama makes before we are born, and that undertaking is that we will be a tzaddik and that we will not be a rasha. That will all be righteous, and not only will we not, just in case we miss the mark, we'll be absolutely sure to be not a rasha, not to be a wicked person. So that's effectively where we started the conversation, and then from there we went into a conversation about the nature of our soul, and we discovered that to say that we have a soul is not absolutely accurate. The truth is that we have two souls. One soul, the first one that we encounter in our lives, is called the Nephesh HaChiyunis, otherwise known as the Nephesh HaBahamis, which means that it's animalistic, that it is by nature very, it is very self-serving, it is very impulsive. And it's the part of us that we tend to encounter earliest in our lives, because a human being in the early stages of life tends to be actually quite self-centered and quite impulsive. And then we learned, but there is another part to us, and that is what we call the Nefesh HaElokis, the divine soul. Chelak Elokam Mima'al Mamash. It is literally a piece of God that lives literally within each of one of us. And that's what gives us the opportunity not only to grow, and not only to develop, and not only to be good people, and not only to transcend ourselves, but more than anything else, it allows us the opportunity of absolute connection to Hashem. And that's what led us to where we are now. We spoke briefly about the fact that the soul comprises 10 different components, what we call the 10 powers of the soul. And then we started to talk about the fact that how does a person connect to Hashem, and how is it that, ironically, a soul could be up in heaven and have an amazing experience and tremendous exposure to godliness, and none of that is anything like what we could achieve while we're here on earth in this world. And it's going to be a theme that continues in Tanya. We're in chapter 5. This is a theme that recurs throughout the whole of Tanya, right through to the end, that the irony, at least for some people it would be an irony, is that our greatest access to Hashem happens in this world, not in the spiritual realms. And in this chapter we spoke about why that is, because we said in this world it is possible for a person to do a mitzvah, and it is possible to study Torah. And both of those things create a magnificent connection between us and Hashem. And we started to distinguish between the nature of the connection that is achieved through a mitzvah versus the nature of the connection that is achieved through Torah. And the thrust of this chapter has been that when you learn Torah, the information becomes part of you. And because this information is not ordinary information, but it's divine, infinite wisdom, so this magnificent union occurs where the infinite divine wisdom is now part of the reality of who I am, which is a magnificent, it's an incredible thought. When you just entertain the possibility that I could absorb godliness right into myself, right into my soul, that's a very powerful thought. And it's with that in mind that we're going to wrap up this chapter by just clarifying what it is that distinguishes what a mitzvah does for us versus what Torah does for us. And by way of introduction, we're going to be speaking about the needs of a neshama. Now, we don't think of a neshama having needs, right? We think of a neshama, we think of a neshama as being free. We think of a neshama as being beyond needs, beyond the urges and the requirements of this world. We think of a neshama as being completely ethereal. And all of that is valid. At the same time, believe it or not, an neshama gains benefit out of the experience that it has while living in this world. And that benefit assists the neshama in order to be able to have its needs in Gan Eden. So one brief word, the brief word is that when we speak about the next life, it's not correct to speak about the next life as if it's one singular destination. There are phases of the next life. One phase of the next life is called Gan Eden, and that's what we're going to speak about this evening. That's where a neshama will go after this life, and where it will live until one of two things happen. Either it will return to this life again in what we call Gilgul Neshamas, which people loosely translate as reincarnation, and is a fascinating subject in its own right, which is beyond the scope of what we're going to speak about this evening. Or the neshama remains in Gan Eden until such time as Mashiach comes. And then after Mashiach comes, there's a more advanced stage of the Messianic age, which is called Techiyas HaMesim, the time of the resurrection. And at that point, the neshama comes back into this world. For the purposes of our conversation this evening, we're describing the experience of a neshama in Gan Eden, the spiritual disembodied state. And in order for a neshama to benefit from Gan Eden in the highest way possible, it has two key needs that it has to have. Otherwise, it can't really exist. It can't really sustain itself in Gan Eden. And those two needs are, interestingly enough, no different to the two primary needs that a human being has here on earth. So what is it that a human being needs in order to survive? We all know, right? There's certain basic things that you need in order to survive. So, for example, a person needs food. If, God forbid, a person doesn't have access to food, there's obviously no way that that person could survive. The second thing that they need is personal protection in the form of clothing. And then, of course, people will talk about shelter as well. But for the purposes of our conversation, Gan Eden is already the shelter. So the neshama is living in a place. It already has accommodation. It's in Gan Eden. So what does the neshama still require? It will require a spiritual equivalent of food and a spiritual equivalent of clothing in order to be able to survive. So once we analyze what those two things are and how they translate into the practicality of what it means for a neshama living in Gan Eden, that will also help us to understand the difference between the experience of connection to Hashem through a mitzvah versus the connection to Hashem through learning Torah. Okay, so that's like an introduction to what it is that we're going to be learning this evening. So let's have a look at the actual text inside. Last week we ended off by saying that there are places within the Torah where Hashem compares the Torah to bread, to food. And we said the reason is because if a person doesn't eat food in a healthy way, and if a person doesn't have a digestive system that can extract the nutrients out of the food, then all of the food in the world actually doesn't help because it just passes through the system and the system doesn't get any benefit from it. And the equivalent in spiritual terms is that if a person learns Torah, and during the course of the time that the person is learning Torah, they don't use whatever processes are required in order to truly ingest and digest and take on board the information in the Torah, so then you get some kind of spiritual indigestion, where you've got a lot of ideas floating around, and none of those ideas actually translate into an experience that a person could, in fact, relate to real life. And that's why King David says, Hashem, your Torah is in my insides. He doesn't say your Torah is in my brain, which is what you would expect. He says your Torah is in my insides, which is quite a strange expression. And the reason is because what King David wants to imply to us is it's not Torah until it's inside, until it becomes part of us, until it's ingested into our spiritual system. That's where we got up to last week. Now, looking at the screen, we're on the second last line, and we are on the third word, which is an abbreviation of the second last line. So we've just ended off by quoting King David, who says that your Torah is in my insides, and we've understood and interpreted what it means, and that is the great value of Torah, is that it allows us the opportunity to bring godliness into our being. So now we're going to take this into the comparison between Torah and Mitzvos. Or there's a whole lot of abbreviations on this line. As is written in Eitz Chaim, which is the core teachings of the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, who was one of the most revolutionary Kabbalists in our history. So you could say Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is like the father of Jewish mysticism. And then you could say that Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Arizal, is in a sense the next major contributor to shifting and moving the experience of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah, making it available to the public. So Eitz Chaim is the collection of his core teachings. Within the book of Eitz Chaim, it's Shar Mem Daled Per Gimel, so that's basically section 44, chapter 3. What does he say there? Shelevushei haneshamois began Eden hein hamitzvos. So the first thing that he tells us in this teaching is that when a soul is in Gan Eden, in paradise, it needs clothing. Okay, so Gan Eden itself is the shelter. So the neshama has a place to be. It's got a home. It's got accommodation. even within a home, it is still necessary to have levushim, to have some kind of garments. Now, we already learned at the beginning of, not this chapter, but the previous chapter, we learned that one of the key roles of a garment is to allow a person an appropriate interface between themselves and their surroundings. So if it's cold outside, the person needs a coat. That will create the appropriate interface to be able to go out into that environment. If a person is going into a space where there's going to be a lot of dirt, so you want overalls, you want the kind of garments that are going to be appropriate for that environment, so that you can go and you don't want a situation where a person's like so busy looking to make sure that they don't get dirt on their clothing that they cannot actually be productive. And likewise, you want a person who can walk into a black tie event and not be there with the wrong kind of attire where they wouldn't fit, etc., etc. So in the same way as we understand in human experience that we have to have garments, and if we don't have those garments, we can't live in a space. We can't be part of a productive society. We cannot contribute to the world if we live without the appropriate interface, without the appropriate garments. So it's no different for a soul in Gan Eden. A soul in Gan Eden, in order to interact with that experience, in order to be able to absorb all the spiritual opportunity, because Gan Eden is a place of tremendous exposure to divine energy, but you've got to have a way to absorb that divine energy. You know, what happens? What happens if a person goes and sits in the sun for too long? So it's the middle of summer, and it's a boiling hot day, and a person goes to sit outside in the sun. If they don't have protective gear, or to put sunblock or whatever it is, their skin will burn. So sometimes the role of a garment is to make sure that we don't get harmed by something that is very intense. Now, a neshama in Gan Eden is going to be exposed to very intense energy, very intense divine energy. On the one hand, the neshama wants that energy. The more it can get, the more it enjoys the experience of Gan Eden. So it needs an interface to allow it to be able to absorb, to be able to take it in. On the other hand, it needs to be an appropriate garment that makes sure that the soul doesn't get overwhelmed, it doesn't get, so to speak, blasted by the amount of divine energy. So what gives the neshama that contextual protection? What does the neshama take with it into the next world that will ensure its possibility or its opportunity to be where it needs to be in the healthiest way possible? Clothing. What clothing? Mitzvahs. So that's the teaching that the Arizal tells us, that all of the mitzvahs that we do in our lifetime now, that provides us with the interface, with the tools, with the garments that will stand us in good stead then in the Gan Eden experience. Then he says, V'haTorah hi hamozoin. Torah will be the sustenance. Okay, so we'll call it food, but obviously it's not food because we're not talking in a physical experience over here. So the sustenance that the neshama needs in order to continue to live in Gan Eden, l'neshamois, that will become the sustenance on behalf of those souls. Now the next part is very tricky. She'asku, the souls that engaged ba'olam hazeh, in this world, be'Torah. So a person has studied Torah in this world, builds up enough internal nutrition for the neshama to sustain the neshama over the course of however long it might be in heaven. But then he adds a word, lishma. That's specifically the full benefit of Torah learning and the fact that it becomes the propellant of, or the sustainer of the soul in Gan Eden, that does require us to learn Torah lishma, for its sake. Now that's a very tricky concept. So let's first understand what's going on over here. We're going to come back to this as we round off the chapter and just distinguish what the difference is between the nature of clothing and the nature of food, and how those two relate to the nature of mitzvahs and the nature of Torah. So we'll still come back to that. But let's stop for a moment and just talk about this concept of lishma, for the right reasons. Now, generally in Judaism, we take an attitude that rather do the right thing, even if you don't have the right intentions, than delay something until you have the right intentions. Okay, that's an axiom in Judaism. Rather do the right thing. But here's an interesting point. In order for a person to have nutrition in the system, you can't just eat anything. You have to be sure that what you're eating has nutritional value. I know that may sound a little bit foreign to the Jewish community, that you should, that there's a requirement to actually discern what we eat, because the Jewish community often feels if it's at a bar mitzvah or a wedding or a bris, it's a mitzvah to eat it. So, who would ever look at things like calories or whatever, just take it in, it's a mitzvah. But principally, we understand that in order for a person to benefit from the food that they eat, they need to make sure that the food is healthy and wholesome. So a person could learn Torah, and that's correct. That's what we should be doing, because Torah feeds us. It literally feeds our soul. The Arizal throws in another layer to this and says, just make sure that the Torah learning is healthy. It has to be lishma, for the sake of serving Hashem. So let's just understand, before we proceed, that there are three possible intentions that a person may have when learning Torah. There's a completely toxic intention, there's a neutral intention, and there's an ideal intention. So let's start with the most toxic. How could you imagine that it is possible for a person to study Torah, which of course is a great thing to do? Our sages tell us that Torah in a certain sense equates to all the other mitzvahs. So there's no question about it that studying Torah is a very valuable experience. How could it be toxic? So here's a few examples from the most extreme. The most extreme would be the person who studies Torah for the sole purpose of now having information at their fingertips that they could use to undermine Judaism. So sometimes you'll have people who study Torah so that they could try and sell a different religious system to Jewish people. And they don't want to sound ignorant. So they learn Torah so that they could sound as if they are actually authentic representatives of Judaism. And that way they dupe people into following them. That is the most toxic way that a person could ever learn Torah. A little less toxic, but toxic nonetheless, is the person who learns Torah because that way they will either find a good job in the Jewish community because they'll be a scholar, so somebody's going to want to pay them for their knowledge, or they will be held in high regard by the community because, whoa, look at this person, they know so much, you can test them on any subject, they can quote the page, and so on and so forth. So they study for the purpose of recognition. So that would also be considered a toxic reason to study. In other words, what's toxic about it? Using infinite divine wisdom for selfish purposes. That's about as bad as you can get. Later on in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe will come back to that question, and he'll say, is it possible to redeem that kind of Torah learning? Okay, because it was built on such a toxic platform. Can it ever be redeemed? Subject for conversation much later on in Tanya. A neutral attitude to studying Torah would be the person who says, I don't have any personal vested interest. I don't see myself gaining a personal, whatever it is, a personal edge, a personal value out of the Torah. Why do I learn Torah? Because that's what we do. We're Jewish people. We learn Torah. It's what was passed down through our tradition, through our heritage. So my father did it, my grandfather did it, I do it as well. Or I went to a school, and in that school they taught us to learn Torah, and they said it was really important, so I still do it. Or the person who says, I know that there's a mitzvah to learn Torah, so I have that intention, but I don't necessarily pay attention to that principle every single time I sit down to learn Torah. It depends on when I'm learning or what I'm learning. And then the Arizal tells us, so what is learning Torah for the correct reasons? What does it mean to learn Torah? Lishma, for its sake. Look what he says. Or at least over here he quotes from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai from the Zohar. If you have a look on page 210 of the Zohar, discussing the Torah portion of Vayakal, which is the second last Torah portion of the second book of the Torah. There the Zohar tells us, Velishma, what is the definition of studying Torah for its sake, without any ulterior motives, without any selfish motives, without any self-serving aspiration? What does it mean? Hainu, the definition is, Kedei lekasher nafshoi laHashem al yedei hasagas haTorah. The definition of studying Torah for the correct reasons is because we've just learned chapters 4 and 5 of Tanya. And in chapters 4 and 5 of Tanya, we've come to learn that what the opportunity that Torah learning affords us is the opportunity to be in a position that we are completely united with Hashem, that our mind is united with Hashem, that our whole experience of life is soaked in divine wisdom. So what does it mean to learn Torah for its sake? Why am I learning Torah? To connect to Hashem. I'm not learning Torah to be able to be called the great scholar of Santon. I'm not learning Torah because I want to be able to have a job, and the only good jobs these days are rabbis, because it's not tethered to the markets. So, even if crypto goes out the window, people will still need rabbis. So that's why I want to be a rabbi. And I'm not learning Torah because I want to know what Jewish heritage is all about, even though that's quite a noble motivation. At the end of the day, it's still personal interest. I want to know what Judaism says about. I want to know how Judaism expects me to behave. The highest level of connection to Hashem through Torah is where a person says, I want to learn Torah so that I can connect to Hashem, to create an opportunity of this unity that we've just been learning about. And I acknowledge that it's ish kafi sichloi, that every single person has a different brain, a different way of processing information, a different prism through which they learn. And so every person will connect themselves to Hashem using a different approach and a different channel, and that's fine. And this is expounded much further in the Arizal's writings. So that was just an important caveat for us to know, that if we really want to have healthy nutrition for the soul in the next world, it will require us in this world to learn Torah with the right motivation and with the right drive to learn Torah. So now we know the last thing a person wants to do is arrive on a trip. Again, if you've ever traveled with Jewish people, I don't know if you've ever done this. I actually had a funny conversation the other day where I was talking to somebody who's not Jewish, and they were complaining about airline food. And I couldn't understand what their issue was. What do you mean you're complaining about airline food? Surely you had other food with you. Surely, you were going on a trip. Surely you had other food with you. You weren't relying on the airline. It's like a foreign concept to a Jewish person that the airline food is actually there to eat. Like for a Jewish person, the airline food is for you to take a nibble and say, ah, and then you pull out your 15 sandwiches and the whole 3-course meal. Then that we've got, because Jewish people think that it's anti-Semitic, that there's a limitation on hand luggage. Because what happens, God forbid, if you starve? What happens if your plane gets stuck on the runway for 3 hours and delayed? What are you going to do then? Can't subsist off those little airline meals. So we know very well how important it is to make sure that you have patkos, that you have tzeidah laderech, that you have food for the way. And that's what the Arizal is telling us of here, that this life is where we pack the sandwiches for the soul for the next life, that this is where we build up the nutritional value that will sustain us as a neshama in the next life. And every person's going to have a different experience, which means that every person's going to have a different level. It's not like any soul's going to run out of steam and not survive. Souls are eternal. But everybody knows when you eat good nutritional food, you have energy. And if a person eats junk, they don't have energy. So how is the neshama going to have the energy, the enthusiasm, the wherewithal, the drive to be able to experience all of what Gan Eden has to offer? Got to feed the soul in this world. How? Through learning Torah, more specifically, through learning Torah with the correct intentions. And then the neshama needs this interface to be able to engage with the spiritual world and to be able to absorb all of the divine revelation that's going to happen. For that, we need clothing. How do you design clothing for the next world? That is by doing mitzvahs in this world. So if we had to summarize this chapter, this and the previous chapter are all here to teach us that the greatest set of tools that we have as people who have neshamas is Torah and Mitzvos, because that allows us to use our neshama to create this meaningful, absolute connection to God, which ultimately is the highest level of living that a person could live. And with that, we'll start to wrap up this chapter, which is the end of the section that describes all of the power and value that the neshama, the Nephesh, the godly soul, brings us. So that's chapters 3, 4, and 5. And then in the next chapter, we'll start to learn a little bit more about the problems and obstacles that we're going to face. And that's because of the animal or the animating soul. But before we get there, there's a parenthetical piece that the Alter Rebbe teaches us, which is maybe just a little bit of a deeper insight into why it is that mitzvahs and Torah have these two correlations to food and to clothing respectively. It is something that we already began to touch on before, so hopefully it won't be completely unfamiliar. V'hamozoin, the concept of food, he tells us, he bechinas oir pinimi. That would represent what we call an or, which directly translates as light, but you could also translate it as an energy, pinimi, that is able to engage a person in a personal, internal way. V'halevoshim bechinas makifim. Whereas clothing, they represent an energy that is makif, which means effectively to surround. So we did already touch on this last week because we spoke about the nature of bread, of food, and how food becomes part of us, but let's explain it in perhaps a little bit more detail. So you might remember last week I said, what happens if we had a whole unity, Tanya share, and we got everybody together from around the world, and we were all standing in a room together, and how we would have these different kinds of experiences. Let's drill that down a little bit further. So you get two kinds of engagements, two kinds of ways that a person could learn. And I think that this is one of the downsides of learning online, is that it lends itself to the one kind of learning much more than the other kind of learning. Let's say that you go to a lecture because there's some very famous lecturer who's in town, and this famous lecturer is so popular that you're going to be one of hundreds and hundreds of people in a massive hall listening to this particular speaker. It is unthinkable that that speaker will speak to you. It's unthinkable. They'll use language that gives you the impression that they're speaking to you. And they'll make eye contact, at least with the people in the first two rows, who's sitting like right in the middle. So they'll be able to make eye contact with them and give them the impression that they're speaking to them. But it's completely impractical and it's unthinkable that somebody who's addressing an audience of such magnitude, and somebody who's trying to obviously convey a particular point or maybe a set of points, there's no way that they could start to consider every single person who's in the room. You go mashuga like that. So the presentation will be what we call makif, which means two things. First of all, they will speak as universally as possible to try and hit as many members of the audience as possible. Secondly, they'll keep the content as generic as possible. So these are the three key points that I want to convey in this lecture. Those are going to be the points. It could be that each of those points deserves 20 hours of further conversation. Can't do that in this setting. So we'll call that a makif experience, where everybody pretty much has the same kind of experience being in the room. Of course, every individual is different, so everybody will process differently. Different people will resonate with different parts of what the person says. So everybody will walk out with an individualized experience. But in terms of the offering was as broad-based as you could possibly imagine. Let's compare that to something that is far less attractive, and that is to sit with 3 or maybe even 1 person and to study that way. Now you have real engagement because you're face to face. You can stop, ask a question, have a conversation, go off the topic. And, going off the topic sometimes is where the real learning happens, because you're going into the world of the participants. So you can actually now talk about the subject in their terms, in their world, related to them. Now, the lecturer can happily get up and say, I'm going to speak now for 45 minutes. Put his watch on the lectern, and at exactly 44 minutes and 59 seconds say, thank you very much for having me. And it's great. And he walks out, gets his paycheck. Everybody applauds because that was amazing. And he delivered exactly what he promised to deliver. But when you're in the one-on-one experience, you don't know where the clock is going to go. You might have a half-hour session. You might have a 3-hour session. Who knows? So that's the difference between something which is makif and something which is pnimi. Something which is makif means that it is one size fits all. It is greater than the sum of the parts. It is not bespoke. Something that is pnimi is deeply personal. Life is a mixture of Makif and Pnimi experiences. The weather is Makif. Doesn't ask our opinion. Doesn't check first if you have a picnic on Sunday before it rains. It's Makif. It's a one-size-fits-all generic experience that everybody shares. Now, one person, when it's raining, might say this is the best thing ever. It's a thank God, it's a blessing from God. And the other person might say, this is the most horrible thing that ever happened. I wanted to have a nice day and it's raining. That doesn't change the fact that the rain is not personal. So weather is Makif. But other experiences in our lives can be quite pnimi. Let's say, for argument's sake, you go to the restaurant. And then they say, what would you like to eat? And then you tell them not only what you want to eat, but you tell them how it should be done. This person wants it underdone. That person wants it crisp. This person says, hold the salt. That person says, put in a little bit extra spice. That's already now a pnimi experience. It's individualized. It's personalized. So fundamentally, mitzvahs are makif and Torah is pnimi, which means the objective and goal of a mitzvah is not to speak to the individual. That's not what mitzvahs look to do. Mitzvahs look to create an opportunity for us to connect to Hashem universally. Everybody who puts a mezuzah on their door has a universal experience of connection to God. You have a mezuzah on your door. It doesn't matter if it's 20 centimeters big or 6 centimeters big. Doesn't matter. It's a kosher mezuzah. It's on your door. It's a universal experience. Maybe one person knows more about what a mezuzah is than the next person, but that's not going to change the fact that the mezuzah on my door and the mezuzah on your door is the exact same experience. In other words, if you are somebody who's learned all of the mystical reasons behind the mezuzah, when you walk through the door, does the mezuzah react differently to you? No. It's a universal, static experience. One size fits all. And so it would be for any mitzvah at all. Whereas Torah learning, no two people will ever have an identical experience of learning Torah. So even as we sit here together and we learn the same piece of Tanya together and we use the same metaphors and we have the same conversation, each of us takes it differently because that's the nature of a pnimi experience. Now we need both. In our relationship with Hashem, we need both. And here's where it gets really interesting. We need the Makif experience to relate to God because ultimately, how dare we say that God could be pnimi, that God could be personal, that God could be bespoke? How can we say that? Hashem is infinite. I'm a little puny little person. How would I have the chutzpah to believe that Hashem is accessible to me on my terms, relative to what I can understand? So we need mitzvahs because mitzvahs create the reality check that Hashem is fundamentally and infinitely beyond us. Therefore, if Hashem says do mitzvah X, we all have to do it. Doesn't matter how wealthy or not. Doesn't matter how smart or not. Doesn't matter how religious or not. It doesn't matter how spiritual or not. Because this is a reminder that Hashem is not dictated to by our realities. That's when you get people to get all flustered because they say, do you really believe that God cares if I light my Shabbos candles at 5:16 or at 5:18? It's not a question of whether Hashem cares or not. It's a question of whether our opinion is going to change what to us looks like it could be arbitrary. Because it's makif. It's beyond us. We don't get to choose. We don't get to decide. It's been wrested from our control. So we have to have a mitzvah, and not just one, but we have to have many mitzvahs, to create an environment in which we live, which is an environment of acknowledging that Hashem is in control, and therefore we do these things. Because we accept His authority and His guidance and His will. So if we successfully do many mitzvahs, when the neshama goes into Gan Eden, it's completely comfortable with the idea of being in an environment where God is in control, except now it's not a theory, now it's what you see. So the more mitzvahs a person does during the course of their lifetime, the better suited they are to absorb that reality when they get there, because they've lived a life that resonates with the principle of Makif, that Hashem is fundamentally beyond us, and therefore we just toe the line in terms of what Hashem said. So when we get to the next reality, it's no longer about towing the line. It's about, I get it. I now can experience what it means that Hashem is so beyond us all. So the upside of Makif is how much greater than our reality it is, and therefore teleports us into a reality that's completely beyond ours. What's the downside? The downside of a Makif experience is it's not personal. It doesn't get into my kishkas. It doesn't shift the way that I see the world, because it's me living in a greater environment. So we therefore also need something which is pnimi, something which is personal, something which, almost like a lightning rod, that conducts all of that godliness that is greater than us to talk to us. That's Torah. And when we have invested in Torah, then when we get to Gan Eden, not only do we experience godliness, but we can digest it. We can appreciate what that godliness means. We can sustain ourselves with a meaningful experience. That's why our sages taught, Shetalmud Torah shokul keneged kol hamitzvos. That the study of Torah is equivalent of all of the mitzvahs. Now, people totally misunderstand what that means. And you often hear from people throwing out that line, Talmud Torah keneged kulam, that Torah equates to everything else, and people use that as an excuse that if they're learning Torah, they don't have to be so careful about how they behave in other areas, because Torah outweighs everything else, and that's nonsense. So what does it mean that Talmud Torah shokul keneged kol mitzvahs, that the study of Torah equates to all of the mitzvahs? It means this. Because as we've just discussed, mitzvahs provide garments, outer protection, makif experiences for the person. And that's as deep as a mitzvah will go, just to the outer aura of a person. Whereas Torah hi mazoin vegam levush. Torah, on the other hand, has both values, because on the one hand, Torah is a process of learning, and as we've focused this chapter, when you learn something, it gets to be part of you, so it's the pnimi, the real meaningful personal experience. At the same time, why do we learn Torah? Because it's a mitzvah. So it's a mitzvah that also provides a garment. Do you remember at the beginning of the chapter, the Alter Rebbe said that when a person learns something, two things occur. The one thing that occurs is that the information is absorbed into their brain and becomes one with their mind. The other thing we said was, while the person is learning, their mind is completely captured by the information. So there's an element of absorption, pnimi, that Torah gives us, and there's an element of being absorbed or being engulfed, makif. So Torah has or offers us the best of both spiritual experiences. So Hagam Levush, it also becomes a garment, lenefesh hamaskeles, to the nephesh, the part of the soul that is associated with the intellectual process, shemislabesh ba biyuna velimuda, which while the person is learning, as we learned earlier on in this chapter, while the person is learning, is completely caught up inside the learning. So it's engulfed by the learning. And that's the greatness of Torah. The reason we say Torah is equivalent to all the mitzvahs is not to say that Torah exempts us from any other mitzvah. That would be ridiculous. A person who learns Torah and doesn't use it as an opportunity to translate the learning into mitzvah practice is not really learning Torah. So for a person to suggest that I'm learning Torah and therefore it equates to all the mitzvahs and exempts me from all the mitzvahs is completely misguided. But what we mean when we say it's equivalent to all the mitzvahs, because all of the mitzvahs generate this makif, engulfing spiritual energy, and so does the Torah. And then over and above that, the Torah also gives me this personalized pnimi experience. Therefore, we say Torah has the edge even over mitzvahs. And then one last little interesting anecdotal point almost that the Alter Rebbe makes is the experience of Torah is accentuated when we don't just meditate in our minds, but we actually say the words of Torah. It's something that he'll speak about again many chapters down the line. He'll come back to this concept. Why is it that Jews learn aloud? Some Jews find it to be very annoying. Here you are, just trying to read a book, minding your own business. There's some chacham at the next table. He's by himself, in front of a Gemara. And he's, with a thumb and the whole business. Why just be quiet? Why do you have to say it? I once told the story before. Some years ago, I remember stopping at a red light, and there was a rabbi, a local rabbi, was in the next car. And I looked over, and his lips were moving. It was like saying words of Torah while he was at the red light. Why do you have to say it? Just keep it in your mind. So he says, because shehevel adibur nase bechinas or makif k'mo shekoseh b'pri Eitz Chaim. Because when we speak, in order to be able to speak, we exhale. That's how the sound gets out. We exhale. And what happens then is the breath dissipates into the environment. And that creates another form of makif energy. Isn't that interesting? So, the fact that we're doing a mitzvah means we're in the glow of holiness as it is. That's already this one level of makif, of this tremendous energy of godliness around us. And that's because it's a mitzvah to learn Torah. When we study the Torah and actually try and understand it with our minds, we do more than just live inside this aura of holiness. We absorb it into our minds through the intellectual process. And then once we've understood it, while we're learning it, we're also putting the words out into the ether. It's similar to how Hashem created the world, like putting words out into the reality and made things exist. So as we're talking, so we're kind of expressing Torah words and energy into the environment in which we live. The Gemara says an interesting thing. It says that when Mashiach comes, there's a verse. There's a verse that says the walls will shout when Mashiach comes. And the sages explain that what that means is when a person learns Torah, the words themselves will become absorbed into the walls of the house. And when Mashiach comes, you'll see those words almost like glowing, like some kind of a spiritual energy. So the walls themselves will announce, did you create an environment of Torah or not? And that's what he ends off the chapter by telling us, is that even a simple thing, just saying the words of Torah, that in itself creates this aura of holiness. And with that, he rounds off the message of chapters 4 and 5, which is, we've been gifted with this amazing neshama. And it's a tremendous thing to have. It's a piece of God that lives inside of us. But that's all quite theoretical until we learn a way to release it and to use that soul as a catalyst for meaningful connection to Hashem. And there's only one way to do that, through Torah learning specifically, as well as through the observance of mitzvahs. With that, he rounds off our conversation about the godly soul and allows us in the next 3 chapters, 6, 7, and 8, to look at the challenges that the animal soul will present. And that's where life starts to get interesting, when we realize we have some adversary to contend with if we want to grow ourselves spiritually.